Welcome to another episode of Contemplating Resonance. I'm your host, Matt Stine, and I'm so glad that you're here with us today. In Season 2, we're diving into stories of religious trauma. We're going to explore how it's shaped the lives of our guests and the ways that they've both found healing themselves and helped others to heal. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're joined by Lyn Smith Gregory, the great-grandniece of Joseph Smith and an expert in family estrangement, as well as the complexities that arise when people transition away from their faith community. Lyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's great to be here.
Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about what you do and your background?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, my name is Lyn Smith Gregory, and that I'm related to Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church. And in the Mormon Church, blood lineage is revered. So me and my family were treated like Mormon royalty. We were held up as an example to emulate, and that required us to try to measure up to perfectionistic types of standards and also kind of live in a glass house, highly visible. And that in and of itself creates its own kind of dysfunction and trauma. But I really was very, very proud of this. I was the envy of my friends for having this kind of bloodline connection. It was a big deal in the Mormon Church. And it was a good girl. I was a believer, but I was curious. And my questions got shut down. And I remember being in Sunday school when this started. And they would say, Lyn, that's not in the lesson, or that's not important. You just saved that question for when you're either older or someone else will answer it. Anyway, I felt like I was just stacking these questions on the shelf, so to speak, that there would be an answer. And initially they were silly questions like, why did on Noah's Ark, didn't the animals all eat each other? And innocent questions, but right. I could tell that the questions themselves were a problem for the people around me, the authority figures, my teachers, my parents, etc. And I learned that questioning was not a good thing. And that does a number on your ability to learn how to think for yourself. So the basic line was either you don't need to know that information, or that will be explained after you die in heaven. It will all make sense, or it's not for you to worry about, Lyn. And I was kind of basically told to sit down and shut up. And as a woman, as a small girl, I wasn't really aware of how patriarchal the Mormon Church was. But there are no women in the Mormon Church in leadership positions. So the role for a woman in the Mormon Church still to this day is primarily that of wife and mother. And the emphasis is on mother. And if she has any other inclinations or desires, that's too bad, because what you're being honored, respected for is the number of children you bring Zion to fruition, the second coming of Christ. And as I got older, my questions became more challenging. I wanted to know why there were the Joseph Smith's diaries, because we had access to a lot of family papers, explained his first vision one way, and yet the church explained it very differently. And I want to know, why is there a discrepancy? And I was once again kind of told that's not important. And you should be focused on memorizing your scriptures, something, to distract me from the question. When I went away to university, I was fully intending to go to BYU, which is the university of choice for Mormons. But I graduated a year early from high school and I missed the application deadline. And so I thought, well, I'll just go my freshman year at another state school and then transfer. And that was my plan. But that plan got interrupted when I had a professor that I absolutely adored. He was sarcastic and witty and awfully funny. And he was also an atheist. And he found out who I was. I don't know how, but he challenged me to defend my faith in next semester's class about religion.
Wow.
And I couldn't wait because I thought, well, I'll really impress this and make an impression on this professor because I know so much about the Mormon Church and he's going to be blown away. But I did realize that he had read everything about the Mormon Church that maybe I hadn't read. And so for the first time, I ordered books that were not allowed in the library, that were forbidden by the Mormon Church for their members to read. But I knew he had read them. So in an effort to mount my defense, I wanted to read them too. And of course, what happened is that these books were written by historians and scholars, and they told a very different narrative about my famous great uncle and my family, and also the early days of the church. And I read disbelieving, hoping to refute what I was reading, but I couldn't. I mean, it was fact upon fact, signed affidavits, eyewitnesses, newspaper accounts. It was all convincing. And within a week's time of reading 4 or 5 books, I realized I didn't want to. I didn't make a decision that I didn't believe. I just realized I didn't believe anymore. I couldn't believe. I had seen through the fabrication, and what I was reading made sense to me. It was Joseph Smith in the context of his times, the religious fever of his times, lots of people starting new religions at that time. And I could see how his visions, which were supported by his family, because his family believed in folklore and spirits and visions. And so I could see how it could all come about. And I realized he had fabricated the Book of Mormon, which is the book that Mormons tout as next to the Bible as importance, as a testimony of Christ. And I realized he had fabricated it. And I really did not know what to do. I felt like a trap door had opened underneath me and I was falling. I didn't want to believe that it was all a lie, that I had been duped, but I couldn't unsee what I had seen. And I didn't know what the implications of this would be for me. Would I lose my family? I obviously was losing my faith. And would I be excommunicated? Would I be shunned, ostracized? Eventually, when I stopped going to church and other Mormon functions, the church came looking for me. And I had to quickly contact my parents before they did and let them know that I didn't believe the church was true. And they were shocked and devastated. My mother particularly, but she really believed up until the very end that one day I would return to the fold. So denial worked well for her. She just said, one day God's going to touch you and you're going to see the truth and you'll come back. And I realized not only did I not have a place in my family anymore, I'm one of 8 brothers and sisters, 9 of us all together, kids. And I was sort of the golden child in the family. Very achievement oriented, got good grades, high performer. And suddenly I was off the pedestal. I was an apostate. I was a sinner. And no one was curious about, why did you think you needed to leave? They made assumptions about why I left. I didn't want to live up to the rigorous standards of the church. I wanted to drink, smoke, have sex, etc. None of which was true. I wanted to believe in it, but I just couldn't. I couldn't believe it. And I couldn't believe that they could believe it. It's like somebody had just turned on the light switch and I saw it completely differently. And that caused a great deal of estrangement from me and my family because there was no place for me in my tight little Mormon family. And there was really no place for me in Utah. I would have been an embarrassment to my parents, to my family, my cousins, the whole Smith clan. And I was the first one to leave after 4 generations of unbroken devotion. So I didn't want to live in Utah anymore. And the opportunities for women in Utah, if you don't want to be a wife and mother, were very limited. And so I decided that I would seek the anonymity of New York City. And so in my naivety, departed for New York City sight unseen without a job or a place to live. And they lost one of my bags. The airline lost one of my bags when I landed. But I survived. And I thought it was going to be as easy as a snake shedding its old skin. I would just emerge shiny and fresh in the anonymity of New York City.
Like the movies.
Yeah, that didn't happen. I found I couldn't unwrap the trauma of my religious upbringing, my legacy, the impact that it had. I think we are all hostages to our earliest beliefs that we're indoctrinated with. And until we unpack them, deconstruct them, they're unconsciously making decisions for us. So started at that point trying to figure out who I was and trying to understand that even though the old tapes in my head were saying one thing, had to almost translate and say, yeah, but you don't believe that anymore. So it's not appropriate for you to feel shame in this moment. I had a degree in journalism and psychology from college, and I learned about groupthink, indoctrination, brainwashing. And so I had a sense of what I was dealing with, but I felt so alone. This was before the internet. And so couldn't just Google ex-Mormons and find other people like myself.
Right.
I was in New York City, didn't know another Mormon. In fact, people didn't even know what Mormons were. It was asked questions like, is it true Mormons have horns? And things like that. So I felt very alone and I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I certainly didn't understand the norms in New York City, how to behave, what the rules were. What did nice girls do? I mean, are there any rules anymore? I didn't know what they were and really sort of felt like I was an atheist. I wasn't going to believe in anything I couldn't touch and see and couldn't be proven to me. But eventually I realized that was a very limiting belief system and that it didn't allow for mystery or the unexplainable. And so I softened my stance on that. And I also, I got therapy. And at the time, there weren't therapists specializing in religious trauma, but I had a good therapist, and she knew what I was dealing with, and she was a wonderful old Jewish lady, and she really helped me understand that some of the belief systems I had were things that I no longer intellectually believed in. And so we had to start the process of, well, who are you? And what has meaning for you? What do you value? You may not have beliefs, but you have values. What makes you happy? Where do you find joy? What makes you sad? What do you think is wrong? And I didn't realize how little access I had to myself because I had not been trained in critical thinking. I had been told the opposite. Don't think for yourself. That's not your job. Your job is to listen to the prophet and obey. You know, what was valued was obedience, devotion, and compliance, conformity. In the Mormon Church, they're really, especially in Utah, in a little bubble. All the other people, I call it the white middle class Mormons, the Wonder Bread diet. You know, very few people of other religions or color or variety. And removing myself from that bubble, well, I just felt so raw and so unprepared. But mostly because I wasn't in touch with my body. My body was the enemy. And this is part of the purity culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was my responsibility, not men, my responsibility to make sure that nothing happened untoward. And I was shut off from my feelings. I'll never forget going to my first worthiness interview when I was 14, and this was to get a temple recommend so I could perform a ritual called baptism for the dead in the Mormon temple. And if you're not a Mormon in good standing, i.e., you've paid your tithing and you go to church and the bishop has good things to say about you, you can't enter the temple. And so I went to my worthiness interview, and this old man that was a friend of who was the father of one of my friends, and he started asking me extremely personal questions. He was the bishop, but it was his job to decide whether or not I was worthy. And he asked me questions like, do you have unclean thoughts? And I was like, I can be blamed for those? How do you stop them? And then he asked, did I debase myself? I didn't even know what he meant. But it was, I look back now, and of course I'm angry at what inappropriate. I mean, here he is alone in a room with me, a 14-year-old, a man 3 times my age, asking me questions that veered on the voyeuristic. You know, were there boys I liked? What did I think about them? Did I ever have unclean thoughts about them? And all I felt was ashamed and embarrassed. I felt like I had done something wrong. I was a bad person. But it also made me feel like I couldn't trust my body not to betray me because I had these urges, or I wanted some boy to kiss me. Women are the ones responsible for not letting things get out of hand. The way we dress, we're supposed to be super modest, no tank tops, shorts. I mean, I don't know if you're aware, but Mormons, once they reach a certain age and have gone through the temple, wear garments, which are basically like long john underwear that come to the knees and have cap sleeves for women. And you can't wear anything that shows your garment. So you're dressing very, very conservatively. And that was to make sure I didn't tempt boys. Like, men are uncontrollable savages. So it's your job to not put them
Right.
in
Of
position.
course. So it's coming at you from two different directions, this control and this trauma. It comes at you from your mind. Don't think for yourself. Do as you're told. Obey. It comes at you from your body. Your body's lying to you. Your body's doing terrible things to you. Where do you turn in a situation like that?
Well, mostly I think it turns into negative self-esteem. And, it doesn't surprise me. There was a study recently that showed that Utah had the highest rate of antidepressant use among women in the country. And that doesn't surprise me because, there are so few options for women to express themselves other than wife and mother, helpmate, that. And if you're struggling, let's say, you have 3 children and you're going out of your mind because it feels like too much some days, and you look across the street and there's your neighbor, Sister Anderson. Mormons call each other sister and brother. And she's got 2 more children than you do, and she seems to be doing it effortlessly. And so you think there's something wrong with me. And it's funny because, in a high demand, high control religion, the standards are usually so high, and they say these are the only acceptable standards. You can't have uncharitable thoughts. You basically can't have the range of human expression or feelings. And anything less than perfection is, and so they create the very problem that make you feel guilty, because they're saying this is what the level of this is the requirement, and then they tell you how you can fix that, and that's by repenting and trying harder, which is a recipe for repressed rage and depression.
Sure. Right. And ultimately, it sounds like, to go back to the example of the interview, the standard that you're being implicitly held to by being asked all these questions feels much like a projection of that person's desires and fantasies anyway, right?
Yeah.
So the system's created not only to marginalize you, but to protect and surround them with the ability to do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, and unfortunately, statistically, there's a high rate of sexual abuse in the Mormon community. And this is true in most repressive cultures where there's so little tolerance for anything outside the norm, and that in patriarchal societies where women bear the brunt of modesty and issues, there's a high rate of deviance. And this is true, and the Mormon Church has been caught a number of times covering this up when it's happened. I consider the Mormon Church a cult, and that's because it meets all the criteria that I define a cult by. I mean, somebody told me the only thing you have to know about whether or not an organization is a cult is whether they allow you to leave with your dignity intact. And I would say, well, that's true, because if you leave the Mormon Church, you are suddenly a sinner, an apostate, a heretic. I've sort of embraced that. In fact, my blog is called Heretic Survivor, From Mormon to Me. And, but I expected to get over this, business of being a Mormon in a couple of years. And the fact of the matter is that it's been decades now, and every once in a while, I can still get triggered, very surprisingly, by something I'm not even aware of that requires me to take a deeper look and see what's still going on there?
Yeah, I can relate to that. There's a lot of aspects of your story. So I grew up Southern Baptist, and of course if you haven't been hiding under a rock, you know that guess what? The Southern Baptist Church is having alarming a rate of all of these things now coming out that you've been
Right.
talking about. Right? While I would say that the diversity of the amount of control that existed from church to church, because the Southern Baptist is more of a brand than it is a governing body, sat in more than one church where, especially at different times, there was both exactly the types of teaching that you're describing, particularly around the role of women. And honestly, I watched multiple people literally feel guilty that they were not pregnant or walking around with a baby because everyone else around them was. And I've seen that over and over again in different stories of different, high control environment. There it is again. And then also I've been in church where, the child sexual abuse, in fact, has been uncovered after having been covered.
Mm-hmm.
And having watched that play out when I was a very young adult at the time and didn't even know how to process what was like, wait, what story are you telling? And then, you start to hear so many different you wonder which version is the truth. And you never really quite find out because nobody really knows except for the people who are in the room.
Right. And the Mormon Church's position is that anything that harms the church is bad for the church. So, anything that would harm the church's reputation needs to be suppressed or covered up.
Well, let's maybe turn the corner a little bit, because I think we've painted a pretty good picture of the problem. So where did you go? I mean, you're in New York City. You said you felt like you had a trap door come open and you're falling. Everything that you used to define yourself has kind of been stripped away. Like, where do you go from there?
Well, I went to a pretty dark place, actually. I was trying to outrun my sense of shame and my inability to be perfect because I didn't give up the perfectionism part of the religion just because I left the church. I still expected myself to be perfect. It was just that I had different standards now. But that perfectionism drove me crazy. And I was in a lot of existential angst about what does this all mean? I mean, are there any rules? Is this just a random experiment in the universe and it's all meaningless? And, what's the point? And what happens? We just die and it meant nothing. And that was a really dark place, especially after the comfort of Mormon certainty, where Mormons had the answers to everything. And now I had no answers to anything. And therapy helped. I was fortunate. I met a woman early on in New York who had grandparents who were Salvation Army ministers. And her family was very gung-ho Salvation Army. And she had left and experienced some flack in leaving.
Okay.
And so she and I bonded, even though our backgrounds weren't the same. They were similar enough that we could be there for each other. And I didn't feel quite so alone. And she's still my best friend.
Amazing. That's awesome.
But I went into therapy. I understood, limits of my parents' capabilities to be loving. Love was something you earned, not something that was freely given. And so I learned, a little bit more about the dysfunction in my personal family. And also as an afterthought, the religious dysfunction of my church, and that it wasn't about what Jesus taught: love, acceptance, tolerance, lack of judgment, etc. And I also got into yoga because I was so disconnected from my body. And the first time I went to a yoga class, I cried. I was like, wow, this is powerful. I still practice yoga to this day. And I also learned how to meditate so that I could get a better handle on my thoughts by watching my thoughts and realizing that if I didn't attach to the thoughts, they came and went, and they were less powerful that way. I could see that there was something beyond my thinking brain. There was a part of me that was watching me watch my thoughts. And that opened me up to spirituality and the idea that maybe there's more in the universe than I can understand at this point in time. While I'm not a fan of organized religion, I consider myself spiritual now. Not religious, but spiritual.
Indeed. It's so remarkable to me listening to you tell that little journey there, because there's just so many parallels that I see with so many other stories. As one of the reasons why I started this podcast was I just like to hear people tell their stories. And just this notion, I'm a student in a program through the Center for Action and Contemplation, the Living School. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And we're studying right now this kind of overarching theme of the path of descent. And we're talking about things like the dark night of the soul and shadow work and the Desert Fathers and early monasticism. And like, these are all some of the things we've touched on. And like, I see that story, like you're falling, you go into a dark place, everything that used to work doesn't work anymore. But then like you find a support and you find something that allows you to get in touch with your body, and you find something that allows you to get in touch with your thoughts again. And like the things that you're finding are common threads that meditation and yoga, and then finding your way to, hey, not, you had that swing where it's like, oh, everything's meaningless, existentialism. I went through the same, like I went from did door-to-door evangelism to it's not that I was an atheist. It's I just didn't do spirituality for a while. Like it just was not in my mind or my vocabulary at all.
Right.
Until all of a sudden I had, I guess, rebuilt enough of myself and healed enough of myself that, oh yeah, I want the spirituality part. I just don't want all that other stuff. Like,
yeah, you became curious about what else was out there.
Right. Like there's something to it. It's just that wasn't it. And so then I go searching to find that. And sounds like you did, I hear the same story over and over. It's just beautiful to me that we find, we go on the same journey, we take different paths to get there. And it's just so cool. Yeah.
I found that too. And it's one of the reasons why I want to support others who are going through exiting a cult or a high control, high demand religion. I want to hear their stories. And I don't have a podcast. I have a blog, and I encourage in a newsletter. And of course, I've written my memoir talking about my experience. And that's really meaningful to me, hearing and being in some way part of that support system for others. And of course, since I left, a couple of my brothers and sisters left, but decades later. And it was over the classic issues that trouble the Mormon Church and others like the Southern Baptists, their position on women, and the lack of women in leadership positions or in a position of having any input. but also people of color, their exclusion of the LGBT community, So one of my sisters, her son came out as gay, and he was adored in his family. He was just an old soul, the peacemaker, gentle, kind-hearted. And my sister told me, she said, I cannot wrap my brain around a God who would not like my son, let alone think he's an abomination. And so just like that, she left and took 8 of her 9 children with her. Yeah. So it put my family kind of into 2 camps, the Mormons and the non-Mormons, or the apostates, as we were called, the rebels. And
there you go.
And we had to figure out whether or not we could survive as a family. Could we spend time together? Or was this such a big schism? And that's one of the reasons I talk about family estrangement, because I think sometimes you can build a bridge back across, but I think you have to know how to evaluate whether or not there's potential in that your particular set of circumstances. I think there has to be a desire on both sides of the fence to have some sort of relationship with each other and be willing to make some sort of concessions or compromises. And we did that in my family. We had a crisis that led us to seek family therapy. Once a year, we would get together for a day of family therapy and then a couple of days of just hanging out together in some cool location. And we found that there was no way we can discuss religion or politics either, for that matter, but not religion. Because how do I talk about something that was traumatizing for me when you regard it as sacred? I mean, there's just no place, there's no path to meet on. And so we really focus on common ground. What do we have in common? We're all parents now, or most of us, and we all have certain, you may call them beliefs, I call them values. They're remarkably similar. It's important to be charitable and kind and respectful. And, we share these beliefs or values. And we found out that basically we're more alike than we are different. And that is what ended up being the glue, cemented this fragile reconnection. Respect, focusing on common ground, and remembering that every human being deserves the dignity of making these choices for themselves.
What strikes me about that last bit that you said is, imagine, what if we all were able to just set aside organized religion and our political allegiances? What if we just deleted that from the universe? We would probably recognize that what we have in common is pretty much almost everything at that.
That's true.
But at the same time, I wonder, it's like, okay, if we delete that from the universe, some other controlling thing's going to try to come replace it, right? Because we still have we all have light and darkness, right? So that's going to show up eventually. And so I guess all we can really do is and to me, it's amazing. Like you describing, I'm sitting here imagining the Smith family going through family therapy, right? I'm imagining the first time, what was
Brutal.
The first time like?
Brutal. Absolutely brutal. I mean, I didn't want to be there. It was so uncomfortable. We had no skills. We didn't know how to talk to each other. And we were coming from positions of, the Mormons feel like they have the exclusive truth, and the non-Mormons don't feel that way. they feel like, well, there's lots of paths to the top of the mountain. But
Right.
Mormons don't think that. There's only one true faith. And that was a real stumbling block. And we had to learn that is pointless and non-productive to discuss religion. So, but what we could do is listen to each other's talk about their experiences, whether they were in therapy, the insights they had, or through one of their church callings, and they're missing their son who's on a mission. We can respect their experience without needing to comment like, well, that's a waste of 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, you can receive it and listen and be there and be present, but not react.
That's right. And that's what I mean about giving people the dignity of having their own journey. I mean, it's very hard for me if I thought about it, to think about some of my brothers and sisters who still remain in the cult, because I feel like they're duped and they're so hard on themselves. I just want to say, dear ones, the path is self-love. The path is forgiveness, acceptance, both the light and the dark of ourselves, and not struggling to be perfect and sinless. But I don't. I keep my mouth shut. And that way we can have conversations about how much fun it is to have grandchildren.
Amazing. I mean, to me, like I've seen so few examples of what you describe that it's almost hard to believe, given the story you've told.
I'm an anomaly, and that's one of the reasons I take care to explain that it is really unusual for parties on both sides of a fence to agree to family therapy to begin with. That already eliminates most people who are estranged. And also there was a desire on both sides of the fence for some kind of relationship. How do we redefine our family now that we're not all Mormons? And what about this legacy? It was what defined us as a family. And now, well, half of us aren't Mormons anymore, or at least a third aren't. And so it took some forgiveness, acceptance. It took years, really, of getting together once a year, having a family therapy session, and then just hanging out with each other for us to work out the kinks and old issues that had to be forgiven and put to bed, old wounds, hurts, slights, etc. But ultimately, it's been rewarding. And we gathered until my parents died. My mother died last year, my father 2 years before. But we gathered every other year for years. And then now we just have a sibling reunion because the family has gotten so big. It was at the last family reunion, it was over 176 people.
Oh, wow.
It was too hard to logistically.
Yeah, for sure. So for the sake of the person listening who is, okay, I'm in a similar boat. I'm estranged. My family's got some similar dynamic to this, but I'm hopeful and I want to see if we can go down that path. Like, what do I do? How do I get started? What resources are available for me?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First, I would make sure that they are getting support from a professional support group or a therapist before they attempt to do it, and that they talk it through with a therapist or their support community, so they're not going back to get beaten up, so that they're not putting themselves in harm's way again. So there has to be, like I said, a desire on both sides for some sort of contact. And that's not always the case. If you get kicked out of your family and they're washing their hands of you, that is not a situation that sounds promising for reconciliation. And I would just have to say, this is the time that you grieve and you fully feel the grief of losing family. That is really very difficult to try to repair. But let's say that you've been estranged, but now you have a child and the parents would like to know their grandchild, and suddenly there's a motive for reconnection. Then you've got something to barter with, so to speak. And you can say, these are my boundaries. In so many words, you can say, love to come and visit, but we won't be staying with you. Yeah, we'll get our own place. Things that are going to make you comfortable. And then, when disrespectful or crosses your boundaries of what's appropriate, what you told them is appropriate, then, you really need support and backup to say, that it's not okay to talk to me that way. And if you'll excuse me, I think it's time for me to go and remove yourself out of the situation. But you have to have that skill set. And that's why reconciliation doesn't come as the next step after leaving a high control religion. Reconciliation comes when you're much further along in the healing process and you feel you can stand up to, without and with great tolerance and acceptance, be contact in conversation with somebody whose belief systems are very different than yours.
Right. So if you've never done that before, you have a lot of inner work to do before you're going to be safe to go do that next.
That's putting it perfectly. You really need to be safe and feel very secure in who you are, and that you've got your own support system ready to back you up before even trying to. And that's what I would recommend, because we can't do it alone. And I think that's one of the things that is so valuable in having these kinds of conversations and being more out loud, is that people don't feel so alone, and they don't internalize all the negativity because it's happened to other people. And it's easier to look at somebody else and say, but they're a great person, than sometimes it is to look at yourself and be able to tell yourself, but you're a great person.
Right. I could not agree more. So well said. Well, I think we'll kind of draw it to a close there. Thank you so much, Lyn, for sharing your stories and just all of the really deep insights. I really appreciate it. I was looking forward to this conversation, but it was better than I expected it to be. So thank you so much for coming on.
I so enjoyed it, Matt. Thank you so much for having me. And I really applaud the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you. And it's my pleasure. Like, I agree with what you said, because benefited so much. My journey is only depending on when you started it began in earnest probably 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little longer, but I haven't been on this journey that long. And I did have the internet, and I did have podcasts and books and articles and people talking about their experiences. And the more I hear, the more, I'm not alone. In fact, I've got a pretty big family, and also just learning I didn't know that I had that support. I didn't know that I could use that resource. It's so helpful. So you're making my job easy.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your journey a little bit, and I applaud you for how much work you've done in such a short period of time.
Well, thanks. It feels really good now. There were times that it felt like, oh my goodness, this is never going to end. I'm going to be confused about all this stuff forever. But like you do you have these moments where you kind of push through a big barrier and you get to take a breath and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do this. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Well, is there anywhere that folks can learn more about you?
Yes, hopefully the book, my agent has sent it out to publishers right now, and hopefully it's going to find a home. But if you'd like to be notified when it comes out, or just see what I'm writing about on my blogs and other podcasts I've been on, you can visit my website at lynsmithgregory.com. And it's just Lyn with one N. And that will take you, I've started a YouTube channel. Who knows what's next?
Fantastic. I mean, there's so many avenues to
Explore.
talk about these things and explore. So it's great. And yeah, I popped onto the website for a few seconds this morning, and yeah, I need to go read a few of your blogs now. There's a few in there that sound like, oh yeah, I want to. I have so much stuff to read. If you could see all the things piled up around me, you would like, okay, you have a problem.
Another addiction.
Indeed. Well, to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to Contemplating Resonance. If you go on Substack, you get the podcast and the newsletter in one subscription. So we're on Substack, but Spotify, Apple, wherever you get podcasts. And then I also do a little bit on Instagram. We are at Contemplating Resonance, and then just find Contemplating Resonance on Facebook. Those are all the places that we chatter. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and say good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world, and keep resonating.